Hi everyone, and welcome to this on-demand session titled Strengthening Your Weakest Link, Evolving Identity Verification to Strengthen Multi-Factor Authentication. My name is Jordan Burris, and I'm the Vice President and Head of Public Sector Strategy at Socure. Socure is an identity verification and fraud risk management company with the mission of verifying 100% of good identities in real time and completely eliminating identity fraud on the internet. And I've worked in the digital trust arena for over a decade at this point, serving both in the private sector and the highest levels of the U.S. government. Throughout my career, the saying, "you're only as strong as your weakest link," is something that's continued to resonate for me as a battle cry of sorts to understand where focus and prioritization were needed for combating emerging threats. Today, identity verification is an area that has only gotten more complicated, and without the right focus will serve as the new weakest link in the authentication chain, even as we seek to employ stronger mechanisms. In today's discussion, we'll cover the state of identity verification with a particular focus on the US and what needs to evolve as we look to strengthen multi-factor authentication overall. So to set the stage, the global shift towards digital business channels left many organizations with the difficult task of deploying processes to verify consumers in an operating environment that was really void of in-person interaction. As part of this rapid shift, organizations opted to employ weaker mechanisms in a number of cases for account creation and recovery. Think about falling back to passwords or even knowledge-based verification or authentication, which weakens the chain created when you bind an authenticator to an identity. To further complicate today's operating environment, organizations are experiencing unprecedented levels of identity fraud due to the ease by which new accounts were created, limitations on account recovery, and the lack of controls in place for fraud detection. In many cases, additional customer friction were introduced for identity verification processes as a mechanism for reducing fraud. This has done little to actually decrease fraud, and it has had the adverse effect of reducing access to services as many good individuals were inadvertently locked out of their account. Now, it's important to note that while many of the headlines, as you saw in the previous slide, were centered around what was happening in the U.S. government, the impact of identity fraud and identity theft overall was felt across a number of industries and sectors. The Federal Trade Commission even publicly reported that in 2021 alone, the reported cases of identity theft were significantly increased. And if you're like me, you may have been asking or left asking the question of yourself of why is this the case and what could have been done. So let's go back to that authentication chain, right? We've all likely seen some sort of image like the one that's depicted on the screen here, a process by which someone is authenticating for a digital service. Generally, you have a user that is engaging with the service. They're being asked to confirm who they are. They have some sort of authenticator bound to them as part of this, proofing or identity verification process, which I'll use synonymously throughout this talk. Hopefully the authenticator that they're using isn't a password and something a bit stronger, perhaps something that is phishing resistant. At either rate, this binding has taken place and they're able to authenticate for the service and based on appropriate authorization, obtain the access that they desire for those core services. To take this a step further, many organizations are exploring and implementing what would be continuous authentication as a step up to help confirm that the user that initiated the session continues to be the one that is engaging in the session and that it hasn't been, hijacked overall. Unfortunately, what we know today continues to illustrate that the focus is still largely centered around authentication and not identity verification. Now, why am I talking about identity verification so much? I really want to make sure that we're all on the same page and we're talking about the same thing. And so just to make sure of that, when I'm talking about identity verification or identity proofing, I'm referencing the overarching process drawn from NIST 863 Digital Identity guidelines. And in this process, there's some sort of resolution event where you're confirming that an individual is real and that their identity exists. There is a process that is used to validate through some sort of exchange that the information or identity being submitted is valid, and this can come in many forms, which I'll cover in a little bit. And lastly, there's this process where you're verifying ultimately that a real person, the real person that was identified, is the one that is asserting the identity, especially when you're looking at it from a digital perspective. When we look at the trends and how they've evolved over time for identity verification, we see a very interesting path. Overall, we started with a more personal identifiable information-based or business rules-based approach, whereby having access to information associated with an individual, whether it be name, address, date of birth, social security number, you could assert whether or not you were the right person. And then based on the organizational parameters, you could set up a match rate that say I had to, achieve 100% match on all the information that was being submitted, and or I had to achieve 80% match. Maybe I didn't get my address right or something to that extent. This further evolved to using what is known as knowledge-based verification or authentication today, whereby you would link to someone's existing credit report and ask for something about how many streets they lived on in their past previously, in order to help increase overall assurance. I mean, I can tell you for me personally, I don't remember where I lived 2 years ago, let alone where I lived 4, 5, 10 years ago. And it's sad to say, unfortunately, that within the U.S. alone, over 45 million people are what's known as credit invisible, which means that they really have what are called thin file credit reports, where they don't have this proliferation or this expansive amount of information, which makes it really hard to verify who they are through these types of mechanisms, right? And for those that are thin file, think of them as folks that are newer to country, those who are college aged, those who are traditionally underbanked, right? And so these types of processes generally did not work for them. We also had the advent of what would be a single element approach to identity verification, whereby we started to look at discrete things such as a phone itself, whether or not it belonged to the user. Or maybe we were looking at an email for an individual, and we were seeing how long the email had been established and whether or not it had linked to the identity associated with it. We were looking at things like behavioral analytics, and these behavioral analytics are things that are being incorporated into continuous authentication overall. The reality is that by themselves, they aren't the most accurate. And then even in some cases where you try to orchestrate them together, you get things that are signal conflict, right? Like, what if the address that I associated with my phone plan is completely different with the address I have associated with my email? Furthermore, what if I'm still on a family plan? And things that continue to evolve for me. All of these things create challenges in being able to verify and prove who someone is ultimately. Lastly, we started to apply what was document level authentication, and you're hearing more about this today, and even a number of groups that are discussing how it could be used as a way of strengthening the assurance of identity proofing or identity verification overall. And in this process, you're taking some sort of identity evidence, you're using it to check the authenticity and perform some sort of biometric verification that the individual presenting it is who they indeed claim to be. The reality is that today that the fraud landscape has evolved to the point where fraudsters are getting more sophisticated. They're able to beat these types of solutions in the industry. Now, there's some of you that may say, well, some of this can be alleviated if we start to move towards mobile driver's licenses. One of the challenges that we'll see within the US, unfortunately, is that MDLs, because they're mandated to be Real ID compliant, we have an issue where individuals are unable to get through the process itself to get the license. Why? Because the associated proofing requirements or underlying verification that's required is still driven on paper-based documents, right? Think about your social security card or your birth certificate. These things, when lost, make it really hard to assert who you are, and there isn't a clean path in order to reestablish it, which leads organizations to go towards these fallback mechanisms. Because let's say that you've done some type of strong binding based on this rigorous process, the person loses their information, they're not able to reproof, or for example, their license expires, to that effect, they have to go through the whole thing. They haven't kept up with things. It happened to me during the pandemic. My passport expired. I actually didn't go through the process and get it updated in time. Completely missed it. They have to go through this whole thing where they have to reproof who they are. If they don't have it, they're raising complaints. There's an issue with customer experience overall. It creates a challenge where you're trying to balance really what is security and that user experience overall. And just to complicate it one more step, there are a number of organizations that basically put everything together, and think of it as phase gates or hurdles that you have to jump through, right? Whether you're starting with these PII-based checks, then you're moving over into these element checks where we're looking at the phone that it may be originating from, or the device itself, and then I'm making you go through document verification. Problem with that is that false positives compound, in that you have instances where folks are failing at each step of the process. They're not able to get through the process overall, which is where you're leading and seeing issues and challenges overall. Now, what does that result to? What comes out of that? Well, When we make it too easy overall, you have folks like Abitami, who was able to defraud the U.S. government for over $1 million, right, by filing fraudulent tax returns because he was able to assert identities simplistically into the system. On the counterpoint, you also have folks like Annette, unfortunately, who was unable to get through the process in the time of need after losing her job in order to help verify who she was and get the benefits that she required at the time. Right. And this really goes down to the point is like not much with identity verification broadly, holistically has, I would say, substantially evolved, and much of the implementation remains pretty static today. And ultimately, if you think about it, it's kind of insane that we spend a lot of time focusing on the authentication piece without looking at kind of that underlying piece associated with how do I confirm, how do I prove who someone is over time. And with that continued focus, by continuing to only focus on one side of the equation, we're leaving ourselves susceptible to being exploited on the other. So what needs to change? Well, when I look at identity, there's still much of what we put in place today treats identity as if it's static, right? It's something you do at one time, you buy into an authenticator, and nothing really changes, nothing really evolves, and you're just updating authenticators over time. The reality is, that's not the case. Identity is not static. It shouldn't be treated as such. It's dynamic, it's evolving, and we need to be able to have solutions that continue to evolve with it, and recognize that folks are different, the ways in which they present themselves are different as well, and that must also change. And why does that become important? Because the reality is that when we see things such as these novel multi-factor authentication bypass attacks that lead us towards pursuing more phishing resistant credentials, that's really only the beginning. And ultimately what we're going to see is malicious users, nation states, and others go upstream as part of the process, and they're no longer going to be concerned with trying to steal the credential. Instead, they're going to turn their efforts towards basically impersonating individuals online, right? Which makes identity verification really a critical piece of that the linchpin, if you will, of making sure that we get this all right. So if I was to paint a picture of where do we go from here, right? There's a lot of things that we talked about in a short amount of time. It's really the recognition that identity itself, right? For an identity that's presented online, there's thousands, if you will, if almost millions of attributes or signals or elements associated with it, right? It can be seen like a jumbled mess if you think about metadata, the way things are presented. Ultimately, there's different factors that are associated with it. If we could take that information and we could help transition it into a way in which we could read it from a machine learning standpoint into more simplistic features, we could then start to move towards creating a holistic picture of someone as they present themselves online, right? Taking the best of what taking the riskiest signals, if you will, and identifying whether or not that person is who they claim to be, or in the counterpoint, making it easier for those that may not have all the information that they historically have needed to prove who they are, making it easier for them to get through the process. When we take this holistic perspective, we're getting to a place where we're looking at the identity itself, and we're not looking at it as a static event. We're looking at whether or not we can score and create risk profiles, if you will, around the identity as it's established, the binding event itself. Like, what if we were to move towards a place where we are starting to look at a binding score associated with it, and whether or not at some point the binding associated with an authenticator should be evaluated overall. And then we transition into what we see today with would be continuous authentication and the work that's being done with phishing resistant credentials. It's really only by taking this comprehensive holistic view that we're going to be able to get ahead of where we see the patterns in the market going today, and be able to shift to more of an approach where identity verification is no longer serving as the weakest link for any organization. Thank everyone for your time today and having this riveting discussion. By all means, my contact information was listed on the earlier slide, so please feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you might have. Thank you.